Hello and welcome to Learn Liberty with another live session. Today we will talk about a pressing issue in politics, especially in the US, polarization. Many people seem to casually accept that we're so incredibly polarized in our society, or that our society is divided into factions based on our very niche political beliefs. On Learn Liberty, we inform you about the ideas of liberalism and also give you a libertarian take on current events. In the last year, we realized that many people feel like they're being squeezed by ideologies on the left and the right that dictate how they think, feel, speak, and live. So we believe that the current political system is increasingly hostile. Political parties seem to forget that they're representing a diverse society. They have become all or nothing type tribal collectives that define themselves almost exclusively as opposing to the dangerous radicals of the other side. So Joshua, he's our marketing director, mentioned this the other day. Both parties call their opponents the other side and say terrible things about them. So it seems like if we can only beat the other side, we could win this war. But we understand that this culture war dynamic is a toxic proposition. Playing with zero-sum game plan always creates losers. Unfortunately, most of the times, well, almost all of the times, those losers are individuals rather than governments. In SFL, we believe that there is an alternative. Live and let live. Our students consider creating a prosperous and free society to allow people to associate as they wish for mutual benefit. SFL is a big tent organization that fosters civil discourse and individual freedom for all. So to make an example, today we're joined by Hannah Cox and Professor Antony Davies to discuss the nature of political climate in the United States and the culture war. Hannah Cox is a libertarian conservative writer, activist, and commentator. She is the content manager and brand ambassador for the Foundation for Economic Education, which I think is the oldest libertarian think tank out there. I'm sure all of our audience knows FEE. Antony Davies is an associate professor of economics at Duquesne University, co-host of Words and Numbers, and he's a Sheets fan. He has more videos on Learn Liberty than any other professor, I think, and he's rightfully the star of our channel. Welcome, Hannah and Professor Davies.
Thanks for having
me.
How are you doing? How is it wherever you are?
It's great. I'm from Pittsburgh, where it's always raining or snowing. So to see a little bit of sunshine is wonderful.
That's amazing.
It's going great here too. We're in the FEE Studios in Atlanta. Oh wait, it's this way. FEE Studios. It's a great day.
Awesome. So I guess we can jump into the conversation because I think we have a lot of questions from our people as well. So to start with, questions to both of you. So there seems to be a general resentment towards the political system in the US. Do you have the same experience? Did you observe anything? Do you have any personal anecdotes? So let's start with the ladies. So Hannah.
Well, I don't think it's a secret. Everybody knows that the political climate in the US is not great and getting progressively worse, at least if you're looking online or if you're really active in politics. I think if you're just going about your day-to-day activities, right? It's not as bad as it might seem in the media and in certain circles, but certainly we do see the temperature continuing to rise in this country. We see more conflicts happening between people. We see a lot of actual fights between people, right? Like Antifa and Boog Boys and these different factions that you see springing up. And so it is getting more contentious. And I don't really think that there's anything to suggest that we're going to go back the other way. Largely, we have two groups of people who predominantly don't know each other. We know that the US as a whole really is segregated still into bubbles. People are extremely unlikely to know people different than themselves. That pertains to race, to religion, to nationality, and it also pertains to politics. And so when you don't know people It's very, very easy to demonize them. It's easy to stereotype them. It's easy to imagine things about them that might not be true. You're not going to have as much empathy. And you're also really not going to have a very good understanding of what they actually believe, because humans are not great at communicating with one another. We know this. The human brain has all sorts of factions within it that actually make communication very, very difficult and complicated, even when you are face to face with someone. When you're kind of playing a game of telephone and being told, oh, these people over here think this, and it gets passed down the line, it keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And because we're not breaking those barriers and actually getting to know one another and living alongside one another, I think it does create a lot of hostility that could be dissipated if we did that one simple thing. And that's one thing I've tried to do in my political career. It just so happens that I'm not in either of these major two camps, right? I grew up kind of Republican, quickly realized when I started working around politics that Republicans didn't actually adhere to the values they proclaimed that I actually did hold to, and certainly wasn't going to the left where I didn't identify any better. And so I ended up in this sort of libertarian camp, and a little bit isolated from the tribes, right? I think we often feel a little bit left out of the political system. But at the end of the day, it's actually given me a really good opportunity to cross those barriers, because I tend to work on public policy issues. And when I'm doing that, I find really strange bedfellows. So for instance, for 3 years, I ran a group that did death penalty repeal work, but we did death penalty repeal work from a right-wing kind of angle. So I was building coalitions of conservatives and libertarians, but then we were showing up at state capitals and working with people who were in groups like the ACLU or even the Southern Poverty Law Center. And what was so fascinating about that experience is that as I would get to know these people and work alongside them, they would say hilarious things to me, like, we really didn't know how you were going to be before you showed up here. We heard you were coming. And within an hour, we were all in the group text saying, like, she's actually nice, right? Because I was the first conservative libertarian they'd ever met. And that really broke down barriers to where all of a sudden I was somebody that they knew and that they liked, and they were working alongside on an issue that they cared about. And so it really took the heat out of the room. They were more willing to listen to my opinions on other issues. They had a better understanding of what somebody in my ideological camp actually believed. And maybe they didn't change overnight and become a libertarian. Some of them did actually move into the libertarian camp after working alongside me. But others at least became more open to listening to these arguments. And so I think that if we want to address the political climate in this country, those are the kinds of actions we have to take. But as a whole, we don't see a lot of people really actively working to break outside of those boxes.
Professor Davies, you can.
Yeah, I think we could probably point to a whole bunch of problems. I think there are two major ones, maybe three. One is that voters, by and large, tend to treat politics as a sport. So you pick your team, and for good or ill, you cheer for your team. And so you get all sorts of inconsistencies of, and it happens on the Democrat and the Republican side, of people complaining about the other party doing something. And then when their party gets into office, their party does the same thing. And all of a sudden they're for whatever this thing is. And so in treating politics parties as sports teams, there's no room for compromise, because that's not what sports teams do. What sports teams do is to defeat the other guy. And so I think that's one problem. Another problem is that politicians have an incentive, and I think the incentive is growing over time, to pit people against each other. The more that the people on the left think that the people on the right are the problem, and the more that the people on the right think the people on the left are the problem, the less apt those people are to come to the realization that actually it's the politicians who are the problem. And as our problems become greater, and you can use as a metric the federal debt if you like, because they probably track, as the problems get greater and greater, politicians have more and more incentive to pit us against each other. And if it's not left versus right, it's, the middle class versus the poor, or the rich versus everybody else, or whatever it is. But politicians have this incentive to point to the problem, and the problem somehow is always external to themselves. They, on the other hand, are offering the solution, whatever it is. All we have to do is vote for them.
They really make it very easy for us to choose between either this and that. But I think as libertarians, we're always very proud of looking outside the box, thinking outside the box. So I actually thought about a question, which we didn't talk about it before, but like, as I mentioned, you would think social media would bring these two different groups together because they could actually hear from each other what they think. But it seems like social media is actually the number one weapon that people are using to deepen this cultural war between left and right, or whatever these two different camps are. What do you think about those? Let's start with Hannah, because I think she was going towards there more.
Yeah, I think that social media could be a wonderful tool for that. And as somebody who runs pretty large social media platforms for my own name, I think that I've tried to create that sort of space and I've seen it work. There's a lot of different types of people that follow me and they have wonderful discussions. But I think there's two important things to making that happen. One, I think the vast majority of people don't seek that out. They're seeking out confirmation bias. They're seeking out camps that are going to not only tell them what they want to hear and already believe, but maybe even move them further into that camp. And again, are oftentimes sowing all kinds of animosity towards the other side and really trying to exaggerate how bad they are and what they're doing and what they think. And so it ends up being counterintuitive to that goal. The second thing, though, I think is really important is on my pages, I really strive to create that environment as far as moderating my content, which is something that's become very controversial across both sides of the aisle when it comes to big tech and social media platforms. But I'll say this as somebody who runs a large platform, I increase the size of my following because I do moderate for behavior, right? I'm never censoring people for their views. People can come on there and write the Communist Manifesto if they want to, and I hope that they'll be argued. And it's a great opportunity, I think, to have this kind of discourse and prove things incorrect and really see those discussions happen in real time. What I moderate for, though, is behavior. People who are treating other people poorly, people who cannot conduct themselves in a political discussion without cussing at somebody or putting them down or acting aggressively. And that creates an environment where people who do want to have these sort of open intellectual conversations flock to these kinds of pages because they're just not that frequent to find out there. It's because so many people are just going for the clicks and they want to just get a lot of people worked up. There's a lot of money and attention and power and notoriety for grabs when you play to that side. And so unfortunately, I think we see a lot of the political people on their social media platforms going in that direction versus trying to actually foster open debate and intellectual consistency.
Yeah, I agree. And I with our podcast Words and Numbers, we have a Facebook group and we moderate in the same way, strictly on the basis of behavior. And interestingly, that sort of thing has a snowball effect because once people start behaving well, they provide examples to others of how you can disagree civilly. And before you know it, there's very little moderating that's necessary. I think there's another factor going on here, and that is the major social media platforms, think Twitter, think maybe more so Facebook, have an incentive to put you in a silo because they're going to show you things that you like, and what you like, well, you like things that you agree with. And so consequently, you will, in those social media, we call it social media, maybe social media is the wrong name for it, because really what it's doing is separating people. So once in a while, I'll encounter someone by serendipity who runs across one of my arguments for free markets, someone who's on the left. And invariably, I'll get a response like, this is interesting. I'd never thought of this before. How come I've never encountered your stuff? Well, you haven't encountered my stuff because the social media platforms we're on keep me away from you.
Yeah, it really does. It creates these echo chambers that we always keep resonating with the same people. Also, a good pitch right now for us that as Students for Liberty and Learn Liberty for the first time, we are on Twitch and we're trying this out. We hope it's going to end up very well. So I'm just letting you know, if you want to follow us on other social media accounts that are not the big ones, Twitch is there. So, Hannah, you are following politics very closely. What do you believe is behind this rise of popularity of populism, if I can say, in the recent years, especially within the US politics?
Yeah, it is, especially within the US, but I think it's worth noting because a lot of people don't pay attention to global politics that we're certainly not alone in this. We've seen a rise in populism across the Western world in recent years. And while I'm staunchly opposed to populism and populist instincts and many of the policies that flow from them, I think it's important that we show empathy to the root causes of it. And I think the root causes are justified, right? And what I mean by that is that populists are largely reacting to a system that they feel is rigged against the normal, everyday people and for a connected few. And they're not wrong at all. They are not wrong one bit about that. We have had so much cronyism, especially in this nation, for over a century. You know, I cover this on my podcast based every single episode. I'm starting with a big problem we're facing right now, peeling back the layers, going back and looking at the origins of that policy, what things looked like, what they were supposed to be like when the Constitution was first formed, before the government got involved with the market, and then looking at the trajectory of how we moved along down that course, how slowly and slowly the government became more and more entrenched in the market, kept intervening to a larger degree, and therefore kept increasing the amount of cronyism that we have, and really getting more and more in bed with large companies. And it's created a myriad of issues in our society that are real problems that people are right to be mad at, that people are right to want a solution to. The problem with populism is that it blames the wrong things for many of the problems that it's mad at, right? People are mad that their cost of living is getting so much higher. They're mad that they feel they're working harder than they've ever before and they're not getting ahead. They're mad because they feel like the game has been rigged against them and they see these other people that are getting wealthier under the system and wealthier and that aren't having to play by the same rules they are. All of that's justified. But at the end of the day, what they end up doing is crying for more big government solutions to these issues, therefore asking for more of the same things that actually created these problems in the first place. So I think they are misguided, but I very much empathize with where they're coming from. And I do think that it's important that we recognize within this the power of the individual, the power of the grassroots, because once people are fed up and they have enough and they start to rise up, it really can start to make a difference. We've seen the difference it's made in our country in just 4 or 5 short years of having this real, populist undertone to our politics on both the left and right. I think the progressivism on the left is also fueled by populism. I think the sort of MAGA Trump camp is fueled by populism, but they're kind of very similar in many ways. And if we don't get a hold of our government and really start to rein it in and really start to get back to a free market system, one of those two camps is going to win out. And we're not going to like either way it goes, because both are heading right off a cliff.
Yeah, and I think that's right. People have a tendency to see cronyism in the private sector, but not to see it in the public sector. And so you get calls for things like socialism, because socialism is going to solve the problem. And people aren't realizing that the problem emanates from human behavior. It's not the economic system that you're in. You can have a crony socialist system as readily, I think actually more readily, than you can have a crony capitalist system. So I think this is right in this sense that people's tendency is to default to government as the solution because they don't realize that government in many cases is the source of the cronyism to begin with. I think another problem that occurs with people becoming disaffected with what's going on in the world is a mischaracterization. And again, I point the finger here at politicians. They mischaracterize what's going on. So they'll say things like, well, middle-class wages have stagnated, and they'll show data. Well, the data that they show for middle-class wage stagnation is correct, but they're misinterpreting it. And they know darn well they're misinterpreting it, right? So the average wage is constant, although individuals' wages rise over time. Standards of living are way, way better, even amongst poor Americans, than they were a century ago. Arguments about inequality and arguments about income inequality have reached the point now that nobody even asks the question, is inequality something we should be concerned about? That's just a given. Of course, it's something we should be concerned about, and we should do something about it. And so we've gone far down this path of mischaracterization of the nature and problems of inequality. And then finally, this issue of people paying their fair share. And this is something that politicians love to repeat because it puts them in a position of being able to pit the 1% against the rest of us, or vice versa. And, the fact of the matter is, you look at the numbers and what the politicians are saying is patently false. The average 1%er pays far more taxes than anybody else, even in proportion to how much they're earning. And the problem here, I think there's a danger that you come away from this thinking, well, politicians are stupid. I wish that were the case. I think it's worse than that politicians, and not all of them, of course, but there's a decent number of them who are malicious, that they will use this information and knowingly put it out there, understanding it's going to foment class warfare, knowing that the information is just wrong.
Coming from Turkey, I can understand the rise of populism and why it's being used against people. It's not just lying to people, it's just hiding some part of truth that doesn't really serve your cause, and then using that small part of truth to pit people against each other, like Professor Davies says. So it is rising everywhere, but I think it affects more people if it happens when it happens in the US. Professor Davies, so what is your take on the resentment towards the political system among people? We see a lot of protests, especially during COVID, before COVID, but also still now. And what is your take, especially from an economic point of view?
Well, the whole COVID thing, I think, was, I hesitate to say mishandled. I think ultimately it was mishandled. At the outset, I think people did the best they could given the information they had. But the problem fundamentally going in is that we never did randomized testing, largely because the tests were expensive and rare. And so what did we do? Well, we tested people who were sick enough to show up at a hospital and put their hand up and say, look, there's something wrong here. Well, you've got to buy a sample. And it was those bias samples that led us to believe that the fatality rate, the case fatality rate on COVID, was 10 times higher than what it turned out to actually be. And of course, that's what leads to all the lockdowns and all of this. Had we known in late March of 2020 what we came to find out round about May or June, I think the whole lockdown business would have gone very differently. And that then created a whole domino effect of, you have the lockdown, now you've got massive unemployment. And so what are we going to do? Well, we're going to cut checks to people because, we're going to pay them because we've shut down their businesses. And then that leads to whatever it was, a $6 trillion budget that year, massive debt. And now we're talking about, well, we're going to have to tax people's wealth to recoup some of this money. And so you get this ongoing string of problems that could have been averted had we been smarter about our decisions early on. And again, you end up in this weird space where politicians actually had an incentive to make things worse for us than they would have been otherwise. And you think this through. You take the mayor of New York City, for example. There are two ways he can err. One is he can lock down when the lockdowns aren't necessary, and the other is he can not lock down when the lockdowns are necessary. And the problem is, if he doesn't lock down when the lockdowns are necessary, that becomes blatantly obvious immediately in body counts. You see people dying because of COVID. And so we can point very clearly the finger of blame at him in that instance. But if he locks down when the lockdown isn't required, it's harder to say that he's done something wrong here, right? What do you point to? You say, well, you shouldn't have locked us down. Nobody's dying. And his response is, yeah, but imagine how many people would have died if I hadn't locked down. And so you can see his incentive as a politician is to err in the side of doing too much rather than to err in the side of doing too little. And that's what gave us this ongoing string of lockdowns. And we're promised that the lockdown will end when the case rate starts to fall. The case rate starts to fall, so then we move the goalposts. And we're going to lock down after the vaccine's developed. Well, the vaccine's developed, and then we move the goalpost again. Well, it's when we get herd immunity, and we get herd immunity, and it moves on. And you see what goes on and on is the politicians continually erring on the side of doing too much. Why? Because it takes the heat off of them if they're wrong.
Totally agreed. And also, if you want to hear more about Antony Davies talking about COVID and inflation, we have two videos actually. One of is cost of COVID which is a 360 video we did on Learn Liberty, and the other one is the inflation, why we shouldn't cut $2,000 checks to people randomly. Changing the topic a little bit. Hannah, I think you know about the institutions and people, the relationship with people much better than, well, for me, for sure. Do you believe Americans have lost their faith in their political institutions? And what's your take on that?
I think they're losing their faith in some institutions, but I also think it's highly based on like the partisanship in the country, right? Like I think they should have lost their faith in all the institutions 50 years ago. People who are just waking up to the fact that the FBI is corrupt. I'm like, did you read about the 1950s and 60s? Like they've always been corrupt. What are you talking about? You know, but it's still very like biased around they don't like the FBI because of things that happened under Trump versus just unilaterally recognizing that there is a fundamental problem with our law enforcement agencies. So it's very selective, right? The same people who recognize the FBI as corrupt and fallible and not very trustworthy still really love policing and the way it functions as a whole of this country. And so there's just kind of this disconnect. I think the same thing is true with the Supreme Court, right? People like it when it's going their way. They like it when they feel like the justices are numbered in their favor. They're less inclined to think that they are partisan or a great institution when it's not stacked in their favor. So as a whole, I do think we see decreasing trust in our institutions, but I think that's well-deserved. I think it's been a long time coming. And I think that there's still actually a lot of work to do to help people see behind the scenes. At the end of the day, a lot changed in a really short time period in this country. You know, we did see a lot of corruptions, especially with the law enforcement agencies all the way back to the 50s and 60s. But things really started to accelerate, I think, around the 70s. And for people like my dad, for example, who's in his early 60s, he'll often say to me, you know, things weren't this way when I was growing up. You know, when I was growing up, the local police department, it was like your Andy Griffith's sheriff. It's very hard for him to understand what's happened to policing, the militarization of it, the way that the Supreme Court has stacked the deck and enabled them to do things like civil asset forfeiture. And so I think there's still a lot of catching up for people to do to recognize kind of what happened during those decades that has really transformed our political scene, where we've really moved a lot of the powers that were supposed to be delegated to either our local lawmakers or to Congress to unelected bureaucrats or to people who are in positions of authority where they really don't have any accountability to the general public. You know, when you look at things like qualified immunity, which has become a hot topic around policing, but what a lot of people don't know is it pertains to all government actors. Like we don't have the ability to actually go and sue government actors who violate our rights. That's bonkers. That's totally counterintuitive to the way that we were structured and the way we were supposed to be able to hold our government accountable. And it's just kind of really evaporated. And I think a lot of Americans have been sort of like frogs in boiling water that has slowly gotten turned up over the years, and they don't recognize they're being boiled alive. So again, yes, they're losing faith in institutions, but for me, not quickly enough.
But wouldn't you agree that there should be some trust between people in the society for that society to be actually live peacefully, or like between people and the institutions?
Yeah, I think in order for a society to function, you do need faith in your institutions, but that faith needs to be earned. It needs to be deserved faith. And the real fact right now is that our institutions are corrupt. They are not functioning as they were intended. They're often way outside the bounds of the constitutional authority they were given. And so people do need to lose faith in them so that they break down what's happened and really push to go back to our origins and create institutions where we can trust them, where we do feel like there's real scrutiny, there's real transparency, there's actual accountability. And right now we are nowhere close to that. So I think we're in a tumultuous place, but sometimes you have to go through a tumultuous time in a society if you want to get back to a place that people can actually have that functionality and that peace. As a whole, if we don't get a hold of it, we're not heading in a good direction. But that's not to say that we should bury our head in the sand and say, well, we need to trust our institutions because it leads to animosity and social distrust if we don't. You know, we have to recognize how far this has gotten out of hand and really try to come in, take the reins back, and try to restore the reasons that we had faith in these institutions, which was that they were accountable to us, the people, that they answered to us, that they recognized that the Constitution was their first and foremost duty.
Yeah, I think people are losing faith in the political institutions, but I think at the same time, there's tremendous faith in the private institutions. We've gone through, if you want to go back 20 years, we've gone through the housing crisis, and then we go through, the Great Recession, basically 10 years worth of recession. And then we hit COVID and the massive unemployment that we haven't seen since the Great Depression. And throughout all of that, people weren't afraid that the grocery stores were going to be empty. Now, there was a short while where we were concerned about whether we could get, toilet paper and hand sanitizer, but largely speaking, people aren't afraid that there's not going to be food when they go to a local grocery store. Thank God for Amazon that, throughout the lockdown, you want something, basically anything you want, save toilet paper and hand sanitizer, you can have it delivered directly to your doorstep. And people will complain. They'll say things like, well, Walmart makes so much profit, or Amazon makes so much profit, and Bezos shouldn't be worth as much as he's worth. And they'll say those words. But if you look at their behavior, what do? They rely on Amazon. They rely on Walmart. They rely on their grocery store. They demonstrate by their behavior an immense and deep trust in those institutions. And so I think there's a bit of a dichotomy here between the public and the private institutions. And I point to one reason for that alone. And that is, in the case of the private institutions, you have the ability to walk away. The instant this business is not doing what I want it to do, is not satisfying me, is not giving me what I want, the prices that I want, I can walk away. I cannot do that with public institutions. And because of that, I have no control over them. Now, people will say in response, well, you can vote the people out of office. Come on. At best, that's 2 years from now. I'm supposed to remember that I'm upset about this particular thing when I go to the voting booth. Oh, and I can't vote for this particular policy. I have to vote for a whole suite of policies that are embodied in a particular politician. And furthermore, even if I go through all of that, this institution that's not serving me isn't going to go away unless a supermajority of other voters agree with me. That's very different than my dealings with Walmart. If I don't like what Walmart's doing, it doesn't matter how many other people agree with me. I walk away. I shop somewhere else. And I think it's because of that ability to walk away, that people feel comfortable trusting private institutions far, far more than they trust public institutions.
Agreed. And it also seems like people are frustrated because they cannot get rid of these institutions and unchanging political statu quo. But it seems like they're taking it from each other rather than taking it from political institutions. Even with the protests, we see it's not towards the government most of the time, but it's towards different groups of people. What do you think about that?
Hannah, it's your turn.
Well, any one of you, whoever has the hottest take.
You go ahead. I thought she was. I'm sorry, I got lost. I thought she was asking you a follow-up question.
Now you're gonna have to repeat the question.
Sorry.
All right, that's fine. I think what it seems to me that people are frustrated with political statu quo, and they seem to take it out on each other. But actually, what we would expect that they would go against these political institutions. Why do you think that people go against each other rather than the institutions themselves?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, other than it's easier to point to something tangible, like my next door neighbor who had a Trump sign in his backyard, for example, than it is to try and point to an amorphous, political institution. I think there's something under the waterline here that's worth mentioning, and that is, I think that people, I'm going to generalize broadly, but I think broadly speaking, people on the left perceive government and governmental institutions as complements to society, whereas people on the right tend to view government and governmental institutions as substitutes for society. And I think a lot of the disconnect comes from those two views, because you'll get things like people on the left saying the government should do more to help the poor, and people on the right saying the government should do less to help the poor. And each side thinks the other side is evil. What they're missing is that they're both saying the same thing. They both believe that our institutions should do more to help the poor. When the left says the government should do more, what they mean is we, society, we should do more. When the right says the government should do less, what they mean is we, society, should do more. That is, the government needs to get out of the way and let us do our thing. And so I think that you'll get a lot less of what you're describing, the people kind of pointing to each other, if we all take a deep breath and ask, rather than what should we do to solve the problem, ask what is the outcome we want. And I think there you'll find far, far more agreement. Everybody, left, right, center, wants better education. We all want our streets to be safer. We all want people to have healthcare. If we focus on the things, on the outcomes that we're looking for to begin with, rather than focusing on the means to achieve the outcomes, I think we would find a lot less of the finger pointing you're describing.
I agree with all of that. I also think one big reason you see this is that people either don't know how to raise their voice in the political system in a meaningful way, or they don't think that there is a pathway anymore. I hear so often from people when we're talking about a certain thing going on in society, they'll say, what do we do? You know, what do we do about this? How do I make a difference? I don't know how to raise my voice. A lot of them don't even know how to contact their lawmakers. And if they do, they get an answering machine. And so they don't feel like there is an actual pathway for them to actually engage meaningfully in politics. But it is very easy to go on social media and air that you're upset with the other camp. It's very easy to, as Ant said, find somebody with a Trump flag in their lawn and let them know what you think about their opinions. And I think that's where a lot of it comes from. And again, I don't know that those people are totally wrong. Our political process has been so co-opted by the DNC, by the RNC, and by special interests that as a whole, elected leaders aren't really that accountable to most of their constituents. They really don't listen to them, at least not more than they do their donors or party leadership. And so I think that that's why you see a lot of this coming back into the culture, because there's nowhere else for people to air their grievances.
And I think, let me follow on Hannah here for a moment, that we talk, and our whole conversation here has been Democrats and Republicans. And what we tend not to be aware of is that both of those groups are minorities. The plurality of Americans are independent. That is, they actively choose. I don't mean passively like they don't do anything. They actively choose neither Democrat nor Republican. And we rarely talk about those. We talk about as if we're split down the middle and there's this behemoth on either side. And it's not. The Democrats and Republicans are both minorities. It's the independents that are the plurality.
It's a great point.
Agreed. Also, I was going to ask something similar on that. The bipartisan politics mostly exist in the US. Outside of the US, it's mostly the plurality of parties and plurality of these diverse ideas, ideologies, and policies. But it seems like the US is really stuck on this bipartisan politics, and it seems like it is pitting people towards each other. But actually, the narrative, most of the times, the populists are using the silent majority, is actually real, that most of the people are not either left or right. They're just something in between. They have diverse opinions about things. It doesn't come as a package when you have one political opinion. So I was going to ask Hannah, do you see this trend increasing in the coming years, that people are pitted against each other because of the bipartisan politics?
Yeah, I do see that continuing to happen. Like, as Ant said earlier, and I think this is an analogy that we use a lot, it really is becoming more and more like watching a sporting event. I'm from Alabama. I'm an Alabama fan, Roll Tide. And so I grew up watching Alabama versus Auburn, right? It's like the greatest football rivalry of all time. And I see so many similarities between that rivalry and what happens in our political system, where people don't even really care what's happening on the field. They just want to win, right? They just really want to beat the other guy. They hate the other guy. And it keeps getting more and more divisive. And as a whole, I think that the problem we're facing in our political system, it's not by accident that we really have these two major parties that seem like they dominate, right? They've come in and they actually have written laws that prevent third parties and independents from being able to even get on the ballot, much less get on debate stages or actually really have a real shot at winning elections. It controls the funding for the races. It's very, very rigged. And so I think while you see a lot of Americans crying out for more options or saying, I'm not represented in these two camps, they're not left with those options. And that also, I think, increases the fact that people kind of keep becoming more polarized because people feel like they have to join these camps, even if they really don't like where this camp's going, because they certainly don't want that camp to win, right? Like, and I've heard that so much in recent years. I really don't like where this camp is going, but at least it's better than that. And ultimately, once you really get behind the scenes, as I've done in the political system, you quickly find out that there's not that much difference behind the scenes, period. A lot of it's just talking points and kind of a show that they put on for their constituents. They actually tend to vote very similarly, but that's the perception in the general public, and it works. It keeps people kind of in this place of fear where they keep voting because they're so scared of the other side winning, and they just feel like that's the best option that they have.
And this rising rivalry between the left and the right, I think it wasn't a problem by and large 100 years ago in this country. It's becoming more and more of a problem, I think, since about the 1930s. And I would point the finger at unconstrained government. This is an unintended consequence of ignoring our Constitution. When you ignore the Constitution, the federal government can grow as large as it wants. It can become as intrusive as people are willing to allow it to become. And all of a sudden now, it becomes really important which side wins, because the government can do all sorts of things it has no business doing. And so I think part of this divisiveness comes from this fact that elections have become so important precisely because we have allowed the consequences of one or the other party winning to become so great.
It became really important who has the power, because whoever has the power has an immense power to change where the society goes, where the rules go. So it does make a difference. And I think I agree completely that it's because we ignored the government, how much power it gathers. So Professor Davies, following from that, who do you think benefits the most from this culture war where we are left inside of who cares most about this tribalism?
Oh, I think who benefits most is very clear. The first group that benefits most is the politicians themselves. And perhaps you could throw in the bureaucrats with them if you like. The second group that wins from this are the cronies who feed off of the politicians and the bureaucrats. And so in an odd way, what's happened is that entrepreneurship is alive and well in the US. But by allowing our government to become unfettered, to do things it's not supposed to be doing, we have sent a call to entrepreneurs coast to coast. Stop figuring out how to make life better for customers so that they will voluntarily give you their money. Start thinking about how you can make life better for politicians and bureaucrats, because they can take money by force from those other people and give it to you.
And also, it has some sort of an effect for it. At the end, there's a power to be grabbed. So it also funnels a lot of fundraising efforts and a lot of political power efforts there as well. Do you have anything to say, Hannah?
Yeah, well, I just want to add, I also think it keeps people distracted. The culture war tends to revolve around things that government has no business being involved with in the first place. I can't stand the culture war, but that's what most people actually pay attention to, because a lot of people don't always feel educated enough to participate when it comes to public policy, right? They don't feel like they're informed, or they don't always totally understand all the intricacies. And that makes sense because our government is so big that when you start talking about healthcare policy or immigration policy, it is so complicated that even me, as somebody who works in politics full time, I know a lot about these subjects, but I'm by no means close to being an expert. I cannot fully get into it. And so for the average American citizen, I don't feel like they always feel like there's a way for them to raise their voice on these issues. But the culture war, it's always around something that's really easy to grasp, that somebody kind of can easily have a strong emotional sort of reaction to. And so people grab onto it, and it has the effect of distracting them from the meaningful public policies that are being passed. And I think it greatly benefits politicians and people who are working in DC who benefit from the fact that nobody's paying attention to what actually is happening, the important things that are actually going down that will impact their lives, where the money's going. They're all just so caught up in this culture war. And so it greatly benefits the corrupt people in our system.
Agreed. Also, following from that, our policies, especially in the US, are so centralized that ordinary citizens, they don't say anything about their local politics or local policies, but you always have to talk about the bigger issues, as like Medicaid or like healthcare policies or education policies that covers more than 200 million people. How can you say anything about that as a one individual? It would not be a good Learn Liberty Live if we didn't offer any solutions at the end. So, of course, we're going to have more questions from our audience. But what do you think? For this is a question for both of you. What are the effective ways to push back against this culture war that we're experiencing a lot, especially in the US right now?
Well, I think that it's very much an individual choice, right? Nobody's forcing you to pay attention to this. You can turn off the TV and go get involved on something that actually matters. And that's the number one piece of advice I have for people who ask me what they can do about the issues we're facing in politics, period, is you can't possibly conquer it all. Pick one issue you're really, really passionate about, learn everything you can, and dig in. Start finding ways to volunteer. Start meeting other people in your community who are also passionate. Start building coalitions. Start messaging. Start writing letters to your editor. Start organizing. Go talk to people in communities where you don't know them and they don't know you, right? Really do outreach. Go talk to your lawmakers. Show up and lobby on the Hill. There are so many things you can do to make a difference as a citizen, even if you're just doing it as a hobby, even if it's just a part-time thing that you're doing on the side, that will be such a better use of your time than arguing over the silly culture war over whether or not they say Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays at Starbucks. That's an individual choice that you make if you're going to care about that. And people need to be more judicious with their emotions and quit letting people play them and fearmonger them and suck them into this sort of vapid hole, because you'll stay there and you won't ever really get anything done, and you'll just create more animosity, more real friction in our society, versus picking one thing where you can go and work on it and actually bring people together and affect real change. That's a much better use of your time.
Yeah, I think my thoughts go to interpersonal communication, whether it's one-on-one, you're talking to somebody or you're posting something on social media or whatever it is. I think we would advance, if you want to say our cause, we would advance things if we were far more respectful of each other. And the key to pulling this off, I think, is remembering that when you're talking with someone who disagrees with you about whatever the topic is, remember that that person likely shares your same view on the desired outcome. And so try and step around the disagreements as to how to achieve the outcome and focus on the things you do agree on. And I think when you do that, you build a trust between the two. And largely, that's the antidote to this left-right culture war. We have to trust each other. And that comes one person at a time. You go, you talk to the person who disagrees with you. You be respectful. And you don't try to change the person's mind. Rather, you just demonstrate that you are a thinking, feeling person and that you hear them and you respect them, and in turn, they will respect you. That sounds really trite. And one person doing it with one other person probably isn't going to have any effect. But if everybody who's listening does it, all of a sudden you are going to have an effect, because this becomes, the people you do this with will turn around and do it also. You become an example of how to build a more civil society.
And this is one of our aims in Students for Liberty, making an example of yourself and creating a civil discourse between different people who has different opinions. And that's how you can actually advance the freedom for all in the society. And Students for Liberty is going to is starting their campaign. We are starting our campaign, Not My Culture War, and we're going to talk about more in our Fear Future Fest later. How do you think can students play a part in this fight to advance our points and advance this idea that we don't have to be part of this bipartisan politics, this culture war? We can actually live and let live among each other.
Yeah, students are probably in the best situation to do this, because why? If you're a college student, you've got tremendous amount of time on your hands. I know you don't think you do, but relative to people who have graduated, yes, you have a tremendous amount of time on your hands. You're surrounded by people who are interested in ideas and thinking about these things, who have opinions. Take that opportunity. And as you engage with others, don't forget that you're not simply communicating with the person in front of you. You're also communicating with the people who are listening, who maybe aren't saying anything. And there it becomes all the more important that you treat the person you're communicating with respect.
Yeah, I love that advice. I think that as a whole, college students have such an opportunity. I don't think people understand when they're that age how much political leaders actually fear them, because they know they're the coming movement right behind them, and they know that they need their energy, and they know that if the young people get energized on something, they really do pay attention. And so you've got this amazing opportunity where you do have more time on your hands than you will later in life. You do have others around you that you can easily mobilize with and build coalitions with, and go and actually show up and start making a difference on some of these issues. And then you've also got amazing groups out there like Students for Liberty that are doing tremendous work that you can partner with to help raise your voice. You can start writing, you can start blogging. There's just so many ways that you can start getting involved at that age that I think are really energizing and exciting. And I just hope young people, if they take anything away from this, know like they have so much power in this country to really rise up and to change things and to move things. If you look at our founding, we were founded by young, radical people who believed in liberty and would not give up. If we get that same kind of energy going with like 10% of the population in this country, we can turn things around. It doesn't take everybody in the country getting on board. We just need people who are really on fire to start getting involved.
Totally agreed. And if you feel like this is for the audience, if you feel like you have a good idea and if you're a student, please reach out to Students for Liberty. We are here to educate, develop, and empower the next generation of leaders. So anything for your cause, we are ready to help you there. And I'll start taking questions from our audience, if you will. So Harkirat Singh, they say that, I think this is towards Hannah, does the left understand the inefficiency of the government?
Do they know? I don't know if they understand the inefficiency of it, but they certainly understand the corruption of it. And I think that that's sort of the area we need to work to build with them. You know, when I was working with them, again, I was working often with criminal justice reform issues, the death penalty specifically, and they would talk about all of these issues with it, you know, about how much money we spend on it, how much more we spend on the death penalty versus life in prison without parole, how excessively wasteful it is. They would talk about the vast number of innocents that we've discovered in the system, how often the government gets it wrong, how often prosecutors lie, and all of these various components of corruption, right? They would talk about systemic racism within the death penalty, which is definitely there. And I'd be like, and like, do you think this is the only area of government where this is happening? Of course it's not. Of course it's not. You know, of course there are systemic racist issues. Of course there is corruption. Of course there is lying. Of course there is wastefulness throughout the government. And so I think it's just, you know, if you can partner with people on things like that and then help them open their eyes to other issues where this is true, I think it's a pathway people have to walk down. You know, just as I didn't move from being a John McCain Republican in 2008 when I was in college to who I am now overnight, you can't expect someone on the left to move overnight either. But what you can do is find connection points with them, get their respect, form real relationships. That's key, right? You can't change somebody's mind by yelling at them on the internet. You change people's minds by getting to know them and having a relationship with them, and them coming to respect you and having respectful discussions, and slowly helping them understand that their ideology should actually lead them here versus here, and that maybe there's some inconsistencies in the way that they're thinking about things. That's the pathway you have to take. But I think there's a lot of opportunity on the left. And I think, unfortunately, we have not done enough to go and actually meet those people and talk with them. And because of that, it's been really easy to sort of disregard libertarians or just lump us in with conservatives. And there's a huge difference. So I encourage everybody, I think if you could just make one friend who has radically different views than you, you're doing a lot to advance our political causes. That's significant.
Agreed. So, Jose Salazar, I think this question is also towards Professor Davies. He says, is it necessary to put a true libertarian alternative on the presidential pathway?
Yeah, I'm of two minds here. I think in a pure sense, a libertarian will never be president, because to be a president requires that you compromise. And if you're going to compromise, I'm not sure that you're a libertarian, right? Because, and so I don't know. I think the two might be mutually exclusive. Now, what would be great is to have a libertarian leaning president. Will that come along? I don't know, but there's something interesting happening. We had Trump for 4 years. We now have Biden. And I don't think that either one is a particularly good president. In fact, the two of them may go down in history as two of our worst presidents. If we get Trump again after Biden's term, as what people are saying, it raises a question in my mind. Is it the case that one or the other, or perhaps both, of the major parties have effectively imploded? This has happened before. We always have two major parties, but they haven't always been these two major parties. We've had shifts at least once, possibly twice in our history, where one of the two major parties is replaced by a third. We might be coming up on that time, and it might well be the libertarians that replace one or the other. And that's a bittersweet thing, because on the one hand, the libertarians would become a major player. On the other hand, they would cease to be libertarians, because to be a libertarian is to state, look, here are the first principles. This is what I believe, and these are the things that follow from that belief. And that's great, and I think it's wonderful, and I espouse that, but it makes for an ineffective politician.
Well, fair enough. But in SFL, we're trying to be a big tent organization, so we also welcome minarchists who believe in a minimal government. That's also possible.
Sure, yeah, and you can make the argument for a minarchist as well. I tend to fall more in the minarchist camp than the pure libertarian camp, and I get lots of heat from all sides because of it, right? And I think one of the things there, I think you could bring a lot of people from the left and the right together here by saying, look, where we're going to start is with a limited federal government. And that doesn't mean no Social Security. It doesn't mean no Medicare. It doesn't mean no public schooling. It means that those things you handle at the state level. Minarchism is about a strictly limited federal government. Now, you might say in response, well, that just puts us right back where we started. No, it doesn't, because remember my earlier comment, the thing that makes the private institutions so valuable to us is the fact that we can walk away. You can't walk away from a federal government, but you can walk away from a state government. And all of a sudden, under a minarchist framework, you're in a situation where we bring the same power of competition that works so well in the marketplace, and we bring it into the political sphere, and it starts to impact the state politics. I think that becomes really, really powerful. And I'd love to say that it was my idea, but the founders came up with it a long time ago. If we just look at it and follow what they planned, I think things would work out a heck of a lot better than they have.
I think we got a very good Learn Liberty video out of this last little hot take. So I'm very happy to get at least one. So both of you are going to be at our Future Fest in a week, actually. Well, 2 weeks almost. So what are the things that you want to talk about? What are the things that you're excited to talk to, or students or activists? They're going to people that who are going to be in the Future Fest. Let's start with Hannah.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to be speaking about civil liberties and the way that we can rise up and start to work to get our rights back. I'm really passionate about helping people feel equipped and empowered to go out and really take ownership of their own lives again. And so I'm excited for that discussion, excited to meet many of the students. This will actually be my first Students for Liberty event. I've never been to one before, so I'm very excited.
We hope we're going to host you very well.
We'll be doing, James Harrigan, my colleague, and I will be doing a Words and Numbers live episode on your main stage. And we think we're going to be talking about something similar to what you brought up here, which is the left versus the right. And actually what we argue is less left versus right than it is authoritarian versus non-authoritarian. And what it means for society to break that way, and how do we deal with it?
Great. Very on-brand topics. I'm very happy to hear both of you. So if you still want to go and join us on Future Fest, please go to our website, or we still have 50% off on our tickets with the code Learn Liberty. So we're happy to see you there. And thank you very much for joining us today. Hannah Cox, Professor Antony Davies, and yours truly. I'm the Strategic Research Director at Students for Liberty. Hope you had a great time. Happy to see you again on our channel, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
See you soon.